First this hour, Ukraine says it's doing everything possible to save the remaining fighters trapped in Mariupol's Azovstal steelworks after 264 were evacuated from the site. Russian forces are now on the brink of full control of the city, though they have suffered significant setbacks elsewhere in Ukraine. Earlier, I spoke to General David Petraeus, former director of the CIA and a former commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan, about the progress of the war, and I asked him first about the significance of the long battle for control of the steelworks.
This battle has gone on for many weeks, more than most observers felt that it would. Of course, I don't think everyone understood how substantial the tunnels and bunkers and so forth underneath that very substantial complex really are. That said, it will free up some Russian forces, undoubtedly, who can then be used to try to expand the area that Russia has been able to seize already in the south and southeast. I'm frankly glad to see that these really quite heroic, incredibly determined, and very, very resourceful and resilient defenders of Mariupol apparently are going to survive and going to be exchanged for Russian prisoners of war and therefore returned to Ukraine. What they have done is really the stuff of legend. I've described this location as the Alamo of Ukraine, and it really has been, except that, of course, in the end, the enemy was not able to do what the enemy did at the Alamo in Texas, which was to essentially kill every one of the defenders. These defenders will live, touch wood, and perhaps, depending on the terms of their exchange, live to fight another day.
And that will mean that Russian forces do then control the whole of what's left of Mariupol, although the destruction there is on a truly colossal scale. And it takes them a step further towards that corridor, which has been part of the strategic aims of the Russian forces, linking up parts of the east of the country with the south and the east, the coast, and down to Crimea.
Correct. It will. That certainly has been one of the objectives Russia has sought in this unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Noting, though, that it comes after Russia has been defeated by Ukraine in the most important battle of all, which was the Battle of Kyiv. The main objective of Vladimir Putin, after all, was certainly to topple the Ukrainian government and replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. That did not happen. The Russians ultimately withdrew completely from around Kyiv. They still continue to hit it with missiles and bombs periodically, but otherwise life has returned to somewhat normalcy in the capital of Ukraine. The same is true of two other northern cities from which Russia withdrew, Sumy and Chernihiv. Ukraine prevailed in those as well, and now it appears that Ukraine has prevailed in the Battle of Kharkiv as well, at least in terms of pushing Russian forces out of artillery range of Kharkiv. And it's possible that they could drive all of those forces back across the Russian border and then perhaps turn to the south and east and threaten the lines of communication from a very important Russian logistical and command and control hub, Belgorod, to the forces that are attacking into eastern Ukraine.
I don't know whether you need to go and let your dog out, David. Is there some...
No, she's just establishing dominion over the neighborhood here.
What then is your assessment of the state of those Russian forces? We had word from British military sources suggesting that perhaps a third of the forces that had been deployed may have been destroyed or lost. There clearly have been some setbacks. But on the other hand, the Russian forces have very slowly gained territory. They are now in control of part of the east. And as we've just been describing, have got that corridor of territory down to the southeast onto Crimea.
No, all of that is correct. For all of their underwhelming performance in Ukraine virtually across the board. There's almost no category in which Russian forces have not underperformed. Despite all of that, they have been able to seize a considerable part of southern, southeastern, and a degree of eastern Ukraine, again, all in that southeastern general part of the country. And that does include that ground corridor that you mentioned that connects the area of the Donbass that was controlled by the Russian-supported separatists with Crimea. So they no longer have to depend just on the bridge that Russia created to connect Crimea to Russia. So this is not trivial. And the question really is, in what look to be some very pivotal weeks ahead, whether Ukrainian forces, enabled enormously by various US, UK, and other NATO nations' contributions in terms of weapon systems, ammunition, other military supplies, and also economic, financial, and humanitarian assistance, whether all of this, as it reaches the front lines of the Ukrainian forces in particular, could tip the scales in their favor and enable the Ukrainian forces to conduct successful counteroffensives that can retake that area which Russian forces have seized beyond that which they took control of in 2014.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen Russian forces pushed back in some places like Kharkiv, but there have been predictions that the Russian forces are going to be defeated utterly in this war. Do you share that view?
Not necessarily. No, I have always noted that it remains to be seen, in part just because it's very difficult, having been in combat, having been part of an invasion, in fact, of another country, the invasion of Iraq in March and April of 2003, and then 4 total years in that country and another year in Afghanistan, among others. It's very difficult to predict that moment when a force is about to collapse or will collapse. There were a number of very stiff fights in which we were engaged in the fight to Baghdad, in which there was very tough fighting going on, and then all of a sudden, without explanation, the enemy collapsed. And so it's very difficult in this sense to say what will be the factor that forces the collapse of Russian forces, noting, as the UK MOD has, that they have taken horrific casualties. I mean, they have to be between 20 and 25,000 in terms of losses alone now. That would be 4 or 5 times the losses the US took in 20 years of war in Iraq. And if you multiply times 3, you get some 60,000 or so wounded who could not return to the fight. And Russia clearly is struggling to replace the losses. It is scouring its own forces, the Eastern Military District included, for replacements. It's seeking those from its security companies, from Syria and other countries in which they've been engaged. And they're shoving them into the fight without much in terms of preparation or the kinds of training that we would conduct, certainly, as part of the reconstitution process for units that have been rendered combat ineffective. And again, it's important to note that the UK and others have assessed that, a very substantial part, maybe as many as a third of all those units have been so rendered, if not more. But again, it's just hard to predict. There are also intangibles here. And I don't think that there can be any confidence, really one way or the other, that we can say that the Ukrainians are going to retake all that they have lost. Keeping in mind that, of course, the Russians are also trying to solidify their front lines, in a sense, to harden them, as was the case with the front lines of the so-called frozen conflict in the Donbass, which I visited not long after President Zelensky was elected pre-COVID, needless to say.
So what do you make of these reports that President Putin is essentially micromanaging this war, that he's taking tactical battlefield decisions himself?
Well, it's hard to say what to make of them. The Kremlin is a famously opaque mechanism. It does appear that he still has firm control in the levers of power there. One would understand a degree of frustration on his part. It's entirely possible that he has begun to micromanage. He wouldn't be the first autocrat or kleptocrat to have done that. But again, we should also recall Churchill's famous description of Russia, description that involved, as I recall, a riddle, a mystery, and an enigma, one wrapped inside the other, back in 1939, I think it was. And so again, one should be careful about taking as authoritative these various rumors or even statements, the same as that Putin's about to be sacked, or that he has brain cancer, or any number of other rumors that have gone around the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about that, the suggestions that he has blood cancer and is quite seriously ill.
Again, no one knows for certain that I'm aware of. It's possible that some in the intelligence world have greater insight, but I'm not even certain of that.
What do you think, though, about the growing indications that perhaps the mood may be turning against Putin within Russia? You've already talked about the scale of the losses of the Russian forces. We saw on state TV today a military analyst and senior retired military figure, Mikhail Khodorenok, saying that Russia is politically isolated, the whole world's against us, this has got to end, talking about the problems in the campaign. Is that not a sign that Putin's attempts to try to suppress any dissent could be fraying?
Well, it can't be dismissed. This is an indicator. So have been certain military bloggers, male bloggers, as they're termed, in the Russia internet space, who have been taken aback by and critical of, as an example, the colossal Russian failure as they tried to cross the particular river in the southeast and were literally hammered and lost what appears to be the better part of at least a battalion tactical group, plus all the pontoons that were going to bridge that river, et cetera. And so there are these cracks, if you will, in at least the rhetorical support for Putin and this particular special military operation, as he has termed it. But keep in mind that the state generally controls the traditional media, TV and newspapers and so forth, and generally is pretty effective at policing the internet, although there are ways of getting around it for those who are the digital natives. But that doesn't include the bulk of the population of middle-aged and older, where the domestic political support actually overall has actually gone up substantially for Putin since he launched this operation. Now, it is still early days. We're just into the third month of it. Awareness at home of the staggering number of casualties, I think, is still not completely penetrated the citizenry. The awareness of how isolated the country is, how it has become an international pariah, the damage that is being done, much of it irreversible, or at least some of it, important parts of it, irreversible to the economy, the financial system, the business community, and even Putin's inner circle. The size of the loss of the talented Russian citizens, at least 350 or 400,000 of them have left the country, not wanting to stay in a country that has again become an international pariah. It takes time for all of this to really penetrate again the bulk of the citizenry that gets its news from state-controlled television and newspapers.
What about Putin's inner
That will
circle, though, David?
Well, the inner circle clearly has to recognize that this is a colossal mistake, an incredible misjudgment on Putin's part, and that his wisdom clearly has been flawed in this instance. And of course, that they and their businesses and their family members and so forth are paying a very high price for it. And that price is going to get higher over time as US, UK, and other Western nations start to target the elements of the supply chains of each industry that matters, one after the other, as has already been the case in terms of the restrictions on the export of microchips to Russia that are made on US intellectual property, which is basically the bulk of the microchips of the world. So again, they have to be aware because they are citizens of the world. They presumably do have access to outside news. And they're no longer drinking the Kool-Aid, I don't think, that Putin has been serving. So but being aware of and then doing something in response to that awareness, those are two very different matters. Each of these individuals enjoys the extraordinary position that he or she occupies thanks to Vladimir Putin. And that generally involves very, very considerable loyalty to Putin. So this is a dangerous position for them. I'm sure that they're reticent, even in the most secure of spaces with fellow inner circle members, to voice reservations or ask questions.
What about the wider response from the West? You talked about the increasing isolation on Russia and indeed about the weapons, the military hardware, the training that the US, the UK and other NATO allies are sending into Ukraine. But were we too slow to support Ukraine? Were we perhaps sending out signals across the West at the beginning of this war to President Putin that, well, NATO would not engage directly with Russia? And did that perhaps give a green light to President Putin to plough ahead with this invasion? Do you think that NATO and the West was too slow to react and too slow to support Ukraine to the extent that it should have done?
Well, I'm sure that with hindsight, we can look back and ask whether we could have done this or that more rapidly, whether there could have been conditional sanctions imposed rather than the alternative in the US, which was either put sanctions on right now, even though Putin hasn't yet done anything, or don't put sanctions on. Again, there will be lots of questions about those kinds of issues. But by and large, I think that the West has responded quite impressively. Keep in mind that throughout, there's always a running assessment, if you will, of how is this going to turn out, and if this, then that, and so forth. So that always is the context in which decisions are made about whether to give very sensitive weapons capabilities or not, and the like. Keep in mind as well that the leaders of the Western world, if you will, in particular President Biden, really had to keep Congress with them in the United States, had to keep our allies with us. We couldn't get ahead of some of those allies on certain issues for fear that Putin would succeed in driving a wedge between, say, the US and the EU, or the US and Germany, or whatever it might be. And by the way, kudos to the UK in this case, because in many of the actions that have taken place, the UK has actually led the way. Global Britain, if you will, has actually materialized in this case. The first to deliver the shoulder-launched anti-tank guided missiles several days ahead of the US. The first with some of the sanctions, now just a few hours ahead of Germany and the others in that case. The first with anti-ship missiles. The most sanctions overall, at least at one point in time. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but led the pack in that regard. And then most recently, the first to travel to Finland and reassure Finland and Sweden that the UK was with them. And of course, the US then followed in that regard. And lest we forget also the Prime Minister's visit to Kyiv.
Let me just ask you then, finally, if I could, David. We've had this announcement today from the British government that it's going to legislate to give it the power to override this Northern Ireland Protocol, the international treaty which it signed. Are you concerned that by doing that, Britain could create new tensions with NATO allies across Europe, that it's going to have wider international implications for Britain's reputation overseas and for UK relations with the rest of the EU, with the United States, and of course with the Irish Republic?
The short answer, in all honesty, is that I don't know. I learned as a military leader that it's okay occasionally to express that you have not complete mastery of all issues. And I must confess that this is one of those for me, just as, by the way, for what it's worth, I stay out of domestic politics in the United States. I do think, again, that the UK has done a very impressive job in this particular crisis. I think the US has as well. And by the way, I say that as someone who not only doesn't register to vote, does not vote, doesn't align with a party or support candidates. And no one was more critical of this administration than I was on the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, the lack of adequate consultation on that decision with our allies, and then the way the withdrawal was conducted. But that said, I think that in this case, that the US administration, and really a bipartisan group on Capitol Hill and the US citizenry have very strongly and correctly rallied to the cause of Ukraine, just as has been the case of the country with whom we have always enjoyed a special relationship. I think that special relationship is enduring, and I don't think that this present case is going to call it into question on this side of the Atlantic. I'll leave it to others to determine what might happen on that side of it.
Well, that was General David Petraeus, former director of the CIA, a former commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan, talking to me just a little earlier here on the programme. Let me just remind you of some of the highlights coming up tomorrow on Times Radio. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, will be joining Asma Mir and Stig Abel. That's at 7:20 tomorrow morning. Clearly lots of questions for her after the decision to announce new legislation to override the Northern Ireland Protocol. Matt Chorley will be talking to Dame Meg Hillier on the Public Accounts Committee report on COVID support. He'll have PMQs unpacked with Tim Shipman at noon. Mariella Frostrup from 1 until 4 will be speaking to Richard Curtis, one of the nation's favourite TV and film directors. John Pienaar will be here with Drive at 4 o'clock, and Phil Williams between 7 and 10 tomorrow will include the international bestseller Michael Connolly on the paperback release of his latest book. So that is just some of the latest highlights coming up here on Times Radio tomorrow. Do stay with us on this programme after the news. We're going to be discussing whether the government was right to abandon parts of its anti-obesity strategy. That's coming up after the very latest news from Mark Tyler.